I take the blame in conversation with Bill, and I emailed him these questions because I thought that maybe out of his work in computer science, he will be able to clarify some issues for me in terms of how logic is related to mathematical equations. Because again, it's like with psychologism, there is in mathematics, there is a trend which is called logicism, and it's the debatable point whether mathematical descriptions are logic based or whether they are something else, whether they have a form of ideality which is not identical with logic. So I don't completely get it yet, but
that's a good topic. I'm not sure I could be of much help right now on it, but surely something like the square root.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Like the square root is an ideal meaning that or x raised to the nth power. That those are like and similar to etc.
Exactly.
And so if something raised to the nth power seems to me to presuppose etc. in a way, something raised to the nth power doesn't presuppose, wait, you have to grasp etc. to understand x raised to the nth power.
The point is, though, the problem is that it's not done by fuzzy logic, because with fuzzy logic, one just, lists all.
I don't know much about fuzzy logic. I think I'm inveterately a fuzzy logic.
And then, so anyway, but let me just make a step a little bit further here. So imaginary numbers will be in this logically unthinkable category, but he said nothing about different logic with imaginary numbers. Everything is, he just I think philosophical researched them. I don't know how much of connection with this weirdness of logic it was in his writings, but it makes, if one makes the next step, then okay, we're thinking about the study of metaphysics and doing science. It's not clear which one comes first. Can we do science from metaphysics? Can we do metaphysics from science? And in principle, then it connects with logic. The next step, You want to say, Jim? Should I be silent? Will you comment?
I'm sorry, I missed that level. What was the question?
Well, what I'm saying is that if we are trying to do metaphysics, if we're trying to do science from metaphysics, there is probably an expectation of correlation between the logic which is used in metaphysics and the logic which is used in science.
Yep.
So if we have this strange mathematical equations which describe the quantum world, we should be probably coming up with equally strange metaphysics.
Yeah, it's I think that at least novelty, when she talks about a periodic space, for example, and dismantles the Kantian view of space, and Husserl's kind of reading of space, but it's the Newtonian. you know, that we that sense of this empty container, which is our actually seems like a natural extrapolation from the life world. But she thinks an analysis, a dialectics of space, challenge the Newtonian Kantian view of space as a transcend, and when she means transcendental, she's not meaning something positive that Husserlian might, you know, say, okay, that, you know, transcendental. It's a kind of a critique. It's merely transcendental, just like the understanding of the flow of time coming from the future into the past or coming out of the past towards the future. Those are two perfectly easily recognizable understandings of the flow of time, but they're transcendental. And they miss for her the existentiality of time as the now, which has a kind of curious discontinuity, even though it's surrounded by a kind of continuity or sameness within which the discontinuity or the flow emerges. And so I think that there has to be the assumption, if metaphysics is going to keep its honorific state as being the first philosophy, and that philosophy is not, as it is in modernity, a marginalized, goofy discipline for people who can't teach real subject matter, you know, at the university, and we'll let them on because of tradition. But it's basically frosting on the cake. The real professors are working for the military-industrial complex. They're working for capitalism. They're working for the war machine. They're working for imperialism, and they're making us stronger as being number one. Those are doing all the real work. But but philosophy in this honorific is you can't do anything unless you are building on the presuppositions which only metaphysics talks about. And it's just, you know, to bring back, say, more recently, if you were thought you could be indifferent to the interplay of presence and absence, rest and motion, sameness and difference, if you could be indifferent to the topic of how being is, and whether we ever do not know being, and whether being is real being only, or whether real being, or whether being includes imaginative, ideal, mathematical being, and whether that is ever unknown. These are all questions that, in the honorific sense of metaphysics, physicists presuppose answer to all these questions, and they really, at that level, don't know what they're talking about. And it's only the metaphysician. And so, but the point is that there is this alienation, historical alienation, that nature is in the hands of now computer sciences. Nature is in the hands of physicists and biologists and chemists, and only they can tell us what nature is. And she says, no, not at all. And she wants to overcome, as Husserl did, the alienation between the nature of the lived life world and the nature as described by science. She doesn't want to, she wants them to come together. And so the logics would have to be the same. There couldn't be a plurality of logics. But to make it evident, the sameness, you know, is very difficult, because the whole problem of the new concepts that are generated, I talked about in our exchange about emergence, the peculiarity of emergence, you know, where you seem to have the whole problem of what scholastics used to call, you know, what causality was, not merely efficient causality, but how in all senses of causality, there has to be a proportion between the cause and effect. That's essential. There have to be a connection. But in emergence, you seem to have no connection. And that's what brain science is dealing with now. There doesn't seem to be a connection. And that's why Chalmers and others, you know, for good philosophical reasons are not, and Strawson, Galen Strawson's son, are not wondering whether all the way down there doesn't have to be mind. In other words, panpsychism is in a goofy kind of poetics, but the philosophical problems of how you get the basic building blocks of materiality to be self-reflective and self-conscious and be able to talk about themselves.
I just want to break in here. I do want to, yeah.
Well, it's I just want to say that in this quantum conceptualism, they point out to isomorphism between thought and descriptions of the quantum world. And then they say that because both are trans-spatial or non-spatial, they are not only the same between the conceptual level in consciousness, which is the same, identical with quantum world, and then cognitive level in consciousness, which is identical with the macro world and our regular behaviors. So it's a very far thinking, but I think it's very enticing. And so if you listen to the first lecture of Di Bianchi on this recording, they're kind of getting into all these concepts, but I think that it's in some very strange ways resonant with Jim's last comment. So
we will be in later chapters definitely looking at her ontological interpretation of Heisenberg's quantum theory. This is early ontology of quantum theory in particular, but also like regarding being and logic or logos. I think that generally what's being contributed to with Conrad-Martius's expressions is taking different regions of being and really setting them far apart from the foundation to get a real good view on them. And from her position, you can get a real good view that you can't get when you're up close and positivistic different types of naturalisms or positivisms or whatever Husserl's critiquing when he is looking is first adopting this view in like logical investigations. So I also want to I want to kind of steer us to the text itself, which I think we can look at very closely and get into chapter 3 this time real closely, and work our way through these categories of the modes of nature, and then finally into this fascinating topic of the apeirotic space-time, the Realontology of space. And then we will also, with this apparatus, be able to have more language, more things we can say about the whole quantum matter, which is absolutely fascinating, but is still just a region, that isn't as encompassing as being and the kind of arcanal being and this sort of language, but also in reference to logic and logics and fuzzy logics and etc. Of course, there's an analogous situation as with ontology. There would have to be definitely some kind of bigger logic than the kind that we've been familiar with in these naturalistic positivisms, logicism, and logical positivism in particular. And so I just want to like contribute to this briefly as well. Of course, Claire Ortiz-Hill has translated a bunch of Husserl's works on logic, and she's always emphasized the fact that the word he uses is logos. And so he's really, as we've seen in the reading group previously with logical investigations, he's really going for something much bigger than the articulations of logic that we've seen. But in fact, he's going for the truth, the real like big picture. And I just want to take this topic to introduce John Moraldo, who is joining us today. Many of us met in Indiana, right? Or before my time, we met him before, but John Maraldo is someone who one of my teachers, David Dilworth, has mentioned, referred me to his work before, on Kitaro Nishida, the Japanese philosopher from what, like the 1930s, 40s, the founder of the Kyoto school. And I just want to say that with regards to logic, what's interesting about Nishida is that he takes the Western logic, the predicate logic of of excluded middle, the Aristotelian line of logic that we have in like symbolic formal logic today, and places that in a much bigger context of the logic proposed in, for example, like the Mula Madhyamaka Karika of Nagarjuna, the this like four how do you explain this? There's a kind of way of looking at the logic of Aristotle as occupying one quadrant of a much bigger world of possibilities, including like if instead of like A and B equals C, it's like not A and B equals C, not A and not B equals C. Like there's like these, you transform these tables into like all the other logical possibilities, and it's just this more encompassing kind of positive. It's a positivity of like the imaginary and all of these other categories of what we're calling the potential, the trans-physical potential world. This is captured in the Buddhist logic, or the logic of the East, Nishida calls it. I don't know if Maraldo, if you're there, if you want to say anything, John, about that. But anyway, it's a really fascinating topic. And in fact, you can also find a version of that logic of the East in some of the work that has been influential in like the emergent systems theory and these kind of topics that we're talking about. In particular, Spencer Brown's Laws of Form is all about this making a distinction, and he's very similar to Husserl, getting to like a deeper, more encompassing logic that's really like metaphysics, first philosophy. But anyway, that's from 1969, and then people like Maturana and Varela, have developed this into autopoietic systems theory. Anyway, I just wanted to say those things, but I also want us to like go into the text, and look at very specific things. And we can go thematically by what we've been talking about a bit. For instance, the topic of the pre-thematic, or also the pre-reflexive or pre-reflective ego, the kind of stuff that is popular, in fact, right now. Dan Zahavi talks about this stuff.
Randy,
yeah.
Can I just mention a little bit about the discussion that we've just been having?
Sure,
I do want
yeah.
to move on, yes, definitely.
Mhm.
But I just think, if you think about what philosophy even is and what Husserl and Conrad-Martius are doing, and compare that to science, yes, it's true, we don't really, when we're starting to reflect about things like this, it's in a world in which you know about things like science and all sorts of cultural achievements and things that have been realized specifically. But the whole issue of philosophy and of metaphysics, and I think this is what Jim is getting at, is it's the question of what is really first? What is really prior to everything and anything? Is that even meaningful to think, to talk about that? Do we have access to that? Is there truth about that? Is that a truth that's evident? And how is that accessible to us? And if that's true, then this realm of what is truly first and what is fundamental, and which everything conceivable or can exist is and depends on, is not on the same level as science or art or biology, or trying to explain the complexity and diversity of the actual
right, and which
world.
is why it's so important to make these distinctions between strata or levels. It's not just here's the world of being, right? This is the naive position. Here's the world, here's being, my ordinary everyday state of consciousness, my physical being as empirically defined by, the real concrete world. it's not just that, and then the dark dimension, like we can call it the dark dimension, but it has, it has very specific true levels. It's not just the two possibilities. That's like saying, well, republicanism versus, democracy. Like, it's not like, KKK versus, like racism versus non-racism. Which is it? It's not, there's just two things. There's true,
Well, I think how the so-called dark dimension might come in is if we, in reflecting on cultural, like art or science or knowledge or history or whatever, we can perhaps access and make explicit that which was already always implicit but not made explicit before.
Right. I mean, look at like negative.
And we don't, in a
theology.
sense, maybe we don't really know that until we say it, but this whole idea of being as such maybe is something that somehow was already always there. And now we're making it explicit, but it's sort of like that's what we always wanted to say. And then ontological or metaphysical reflection is saying that, but it's not explaining things that are right there before us. It's sort of making explicit that which was fundamentally always there, no matter what.
Of course, it also clarifies or explains what is, the naive like presentation as well, and it places it in that, like so I was going to draw this analogy with like the via negativa, right? Here's the natural world. There's like a transnatural realm in like pseudo-Dionysus or something, and then there's like all these hierarchies, all these orders of angels, and in philosophical cosmologies, as we've seen a bit, there's all these different levels. And what we need now is a kind of logic, maybe of a Western style of presentation, that's able to show how those, what'd you call them? Like first things, the true reality of what's prior and first, but I mean, just to use the language you were using just now, but I mean, the truth and being, like what philosophers are all about, what we're devoted to is that it's not just relativism, but there's, and it's not just like dogmatic absolutism of the varieties we've seen, but that there is some truth, and that we want to get to it. And we also want to place this world and our experiences and our objects in their proper place. So like Timonetska is all about this placing. She calls it geocosmic transcendental positioning. She makes the joke in the 90s when they're developing GPS that this is her GPS, places the world in this bigger picture. And similarly, and I think with Kitaro Nishida, when you have this big picture, and I think in the Western tradition, it's like having the experience of the visio beatifica, the great vision of the all, this experience of the divine, that you really like set the world in relief. The whole world, like with meditative practices, one experience you might go through, which is an imaginary thing, sure, but the point is to like show the imaginary world at play in our life, including like the categories of space-time having their transcendental imaginative dimensions or aspects, and just situating us in relation to the real and the imaginary in everyday life. It's kind of like the psychopathology of everyday life, but it's even deeper than that, right? Because it's like the life of the imagination, or choose a different metaphor, like the trans-physical potencies,
I think I see what you're saying. Science, or many things, explain things of this world on their own terms. We can have metaphysical reflection that sort of grasps the essence of being, but then how do things on their own terms then appear when we see them in the context of having grasped the essence of being as such? And that's in a way different, but it's not the same thing as just another explanation.
Right, exactly.
I can, excuse me, Randy, we need to return to the text because we won't be learning, and we can have another group with discussion of big ideas, but I think to stick to the point.
Right. I was hoping today we would just really look at the text. I just want to start with.
Well, can I just mention one thing there, because, and I think this is a core idea about what she's doing. it's not science, it's metaphysics. And that's the context. I think what I'm trying to say and what Jim's trying to say is, and I think really, I don't think what she's doing makes sense unless we take into account what Jim and Randy and I have just been bringing up. That she is trying to understand being as such and what it means to even be, and how then that might relate to things like matter and individual beings and individual consciousness and essences. That's where she's coming from. And it's not just another scientific contribution.
Okay.
And yeah, so anyway, I think that's, yeah, anyway, but
Yeah,
you're right. Let's
the
get back to the
text
specifics of
Yeah,
it.
Jeremy,
Yeah.
it's clear it is metaphysics. It's clear it is related to being, but I want to see the text and understand
Definitely,
what
yeah.
Jim wrote about Conrad.
Right.
So
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So so let me share the. So I have, as we've seen before, I have a certain presentation of the text. So let me share that so we can get to chapter 3 and have a nice close look at it. All right, and get my laser pointer. Okay, so I've been updating this document once again, and okay, so we've seen this stuff, and please, no one have a seizure. I'm going to bring us all the way through the flipping of pages to where we are. So I'm just going to bring us to chapter 3. Here we go. And in this chapter 3, we've already looked at some of this stuff. We didn't look at this. This stuff is cool, the diagrams, but here's the stuff we didn't talk about yet, because I just added this stuff, and I just want to bring us to a certain location on page 90, and this is also relevant to what we've been talking about. There's this, and I was talking to Jim the other day about this, non-reflective. So we've been talking about the pre-reflective, and that's interesting, especially because it does connect to themes like that Dan Zahavi's been talking about recently in his book that just came out last year. And you know, Merleau-Ponty, of course, like the tacit cogito and the tacit logos and all these things are pre-thematic and pre-reflective. And in other works, in the visible and the invisible, Merleau-Ponty talks all about reflection and this pre-reflective dimension. But what's really cool about Conrad-Martius is she doesn't just say there's, you know, the dark dimension. I mean, that's a cool term, and you know, and Husserl, the dark something, like that's all cool. But the point is to shine light in that darkness, you know, and to show that there's a striation or like a rainbow, a spectrum between what we can say for sure about the foundational stuff and what we can say for sure about like our lived experience. You know, there's a whole spectrum in there. So I think that, you know, indeed this is science, and it is natural science in addition to being this, you know, really important transnatural scaffold or tapestry or orchestra or symphony, you know, that it's standing on, that it's standing in. And you know, what's important for her is that it's a kind of self-grounding, self-standing, you know. And so I think it would be really important for us to look closely at this chapter, and especially these things, Hyletic and Pneumatic Substance, and understand what they are, understand, you know, which one is the like self-standing, what does that mean? You know, what is it about matter that has a kind of self-absorption, you know, and what is it about spirit, or all the domain of various forms of self and reflectivity, you know, awareness, light, manifestation, you know, consciousness, that is something very different than the Hyletic being, but something arcanal. And what does that mean? What is this word, arcanal being? And I think that there's this cool term here in this footnote, in footnote 105 on page 90, It says, much of Conrad-Martius's discussion here is a confrontation with some Heideggerian notions from the standpoint of the real ontology. It may also be a way of thinking ontologically about the essentially non-reflective, not merely pre-reflective nature of the eye's self-awareness. This is really cool because it introduces a kind of term like pre-reflective, but something way deeper, you could say deeper and higher, you know, or more central and peripheral at the same time. Something you could say darker as far as like the Dunkel dimension goes. Something non-reflective or like pre-thematic and like, anyway, I just think this is emblematic of what we've been talking about. The more recent like phenomenologies of emotion and the heart and more axiological metaphysical work we've seen like in Dan Zahavi, and also, and Jim talks about this stuff in other works of his, and also like Anthony Steinbach and Ed Casey are making phenomenologies of the emotions and of the heart. You know, they're getting in these axiological areas, maybe in part standing on the kind of work of like Paul Ricoeur, who deals with these things, but also Merleau-Ponty and foremost Husserl. So it's interesting to see the Conrad-Martius direction from this stuff, this standing in a certain understanding of Husserl that gives, you know, it's like standing on the peak of the mountain and you get to see like so much more. So I just wanted to like direct us to like 3.7 Pneumatic Substance and 3.6 Hyletic Substance, but also like maybe we should really begin earlier and just kind of comb through chapter 3. You know, and I don't want to pass up passing time for sure, but as I mentioned in one of those emails I sent out, this is a really fascinating topic, and it is especially enlightening for giving us a kind of emblematic image of her philosophy, especially when the analysis of passing time or time in the usual sense, and more strictly time in the Aristotelian sense, you know, which then relates to the Newtonian and the contemporary sense, in relation to the aeonic space-time, which I think we're going to talk a lot more about towards the end of the book, especially. So, I mean, you know, and I was also going to maybe show the diagrams that I was referring to from Nishida, but I can do that in an email. There's some interesting, there's a diagram of the infinite sphere that Kitaro Nishida has that's divided into 4 quadrants. And I'd be interested, you know, I don't know if John Meraldo, if you're able to join us in audio, but you know, I'd love some time to hear what you have to say about that, because it's definitely the kind of stuff that we were talking about before with regards to logic, and it is very much like the kind of contribution of Conrad-Martius to philosophy of nature with this strata of transnatural potencies, potentialities, which is also a part of the whole philosophy of entelecheia, which was, you know, obviously coming from Aristotle, but has this rich scholastic heritage and neo-scholastic and romantic influence in German idealism, and then it has turned into some interesting things. I just want to show that Conrad-Martius is expressing a species of this stuff, but you also find it in like Hans Dreich. She's kind of pulling on Hans Dreich. And you know, it relates to things that are occult and paranormal or supernatural, and so it's interesting to see the legacy of this concept of entelechy also in like Rudolf Steiner's work, you know, in anthroposophical circles, and generally this is part of German critical realism, or the realism of starting with Herbart of the Kantian line. He interprets Kant's work like the transcendental aesthetic in a realist mode, So German kritischer Realismus. Alois Wenzel is a big proponent of this stuff. We've mentioned this before. Jim pointed this stuff out to me in the past. Unsterblichkeit, Immortality by Wenzel. He was a part of Conrad-Martius's space-time reading group, kind of like what we're doing in Munich back in the day. And he has a very similar sort of discourse about early ontological interpretation of the fourth spatial dimension, stuff like that. So, and then as we mentioned, and as I pointed out in these emails, Burkhard Heim is a really interesting figure. He develops his theoretical physics, Heim theory, in connection with Conrad-Martius and this whole intellectual stratification of the transnatural potencies with his hyperspace theory that deals with other dimensions as well. So anyway, I just wanted to point that stuff out. And while I have rambled, I hope other people would like to bring up points. I know, Jeremy, you were really interested in chapter 3, but also any other voices who we haven't heard as much. If anyone wanted to get into themes from chapter 3, we can look at the text very closely now. I'll share it again. We can look at it. Does anyone want to direct us a little bit?
This is Bill.
Yeah.
So I just want to start with something more fundamental. So regarding the Hyletic, regarding both the Hyletic and the, what's the other one that she calls it?
Pneumatic.
Yeah, pneumatic. What we need is, and I think Jim gives us a hint here in the beginning of chapter 3.6 as to what are the paradigmatic phenomena that are guiding our eidetic analysis. So I'd ask that for both the Hyletic and the pneumatic.
Well, I mean, what do you think, Jim? Isn't it, this is about materiality in general. I mean, the ide here that in this eidetic analysis refers to that of material substantiality itself. Right?
No, but it would be, but for example, again, to give me my naive understanding, when I'm asking for phenomena, I mean, like, for example, that by materiality you mean, and he mentions it has to do with pretty much the Lebenswelt, the everyday world. So it's something like the Hyletic substance is phenomena is like something you kick, and it kicks back to recount Johnson's famous thing. So is that the general idea of what the phenomena that's guiding our understanding of this substance?
I think that this is a good question, and thanks, Bill. The Hyletic for her has a two overtones. The word Hyle has for her the overtone of that materiality. We use like, you go to a material goods store and everything is stuff for something else. You get to go, you want to, if you go to material goods stores, the material there is what the customer is going to make curtains out of, bedspreads out of, rugs out of, so forth and so on. So it's the stuff. So that's another word that's I think basic for Hyle, is the stuff out of which all the things we perceive in the world are made. But the other sense of Hyle is the more exemplary sense of Hyle, that it's a body. And for her, the sense of bodiliness it's Cartesian, but it's older than that. For the scholastics, the definition of bodiliness was pars extra partes, parts outside of parts. So it was something which was self-extended. So the two notions here, when we're dealing with materiality that are tied to the word Hyle, are the stuff out of which And so that becomes the original phenomenon, the stuff out of which and the bodiliness, which we're each equally familiar with. And then always in the background, of course, is the contrast note, a contrast consideration, which is, that would be a limit consideration. Is there anything which is pure stuff, pure materiality? And Aristotle's prime matter was precisely that, but she is moving in the Aristotelian direction of getting and prime matter was always basically a principle, an ontological, metaphysical explanatory principle. It's not something you perceived. She's moving in that direction. This is not, you don't perceive, strictly speaking, Hyle or the Hyletic substance. You perceive material substances which you may analyze and see that they are comprised of the Hyletic principle. Because the whole the focus is on the Realontology, or the real substance, and substances and the real being a substance out of which something emerges, how does materiality have any substantiality? In contrast, for example, a clear notion of substance is that which is in itself and by itself, and in a higher level for itself. The Hyle seems to go in the other direction. It's not for itself, and it is in fact always losing itself while keeping itself. It's self-extending without being something which is in itself. But its whole being is to constantly surpass itself without being together with itself, without losing itself.
I think you're going too fast. That's my view. So the way I would go about this, where I Conrad-Martius, is I would start making a list. That's just my stupid way. And I'd start making a list of things that I'm trying, I mean, maybe I'm wrong in thinking about this, that I'm trying to find a superset or something. And so, so for example, I can think about things that make curtains out of, but then I start wondering about things that are not part of my perceptive field, my phenomenal field. Things like electrons or muons. Are these in the list of Hyletic? In other words, I'm trying to know what delimits, what demarcates this category.
Yep.
And maybe that's where the pneumatic comes in.
No, well, that's precisely where we're going, Bill, because the Hyletic, she has this homology, the sameness of meaning, actually eidetics poetics, between the Hyletic. When she gives the features of the Hyletic, they have a kind of symmetry with the features of light. There is an ecstatic character of light being outside of itself, irradiating itself, we say. And she's going to show how she's going to attempt to show how the quantum claim that materiality, as it's analyzed in the atomistic structure, basically is dissolved when we start thinking about and are studying the behavior of the subatomic in terms of the quantum phenomena of say of electrons. And that what are they? That they have some of the eidetic, for her, some of the eidetic, they have eidetic similarity with the analysis of a body we experience within the life world, if we properly analyze it in terms of its extendedness and what this self-extension is. And there's the self-extendedness of a body in the life world is at its root levels in terms of the physical account, is going to be saturated or pervaded by and founded in the realm of light as a physical entity, not as a phenomenological entity right now. Does that help at all?
Starting to.
She doesn't start with, Bill, she doesn't start with physics. Mhm.
Well, she's starting, according to you, she's starting in the pre-scientific world.
Yes.
Okay, so that's where I want to start, because that I know about.
Yeah, that's right. She's starting, but admittedly, this is very abstract stuff and she's not always terribly helpful. But when she's thinking about what it means for a body to be extended, it leads as later on both to the analysis of time and space, in what sense it's temporal and what sense it's spatial. And she comes up with the kind of Kantian antinomies of time and space that are integrated ultimately into this larger picture, which includes then bodiliness as we experience it, bodiliness as it emerges as in our eidetic reflection on it, and bodiliness as it is constituted in the physical world of physicists.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easier to, with her work, to start with the distinctions that she's making, like between the Hyletic and the Pneumatic, and get understanding like what the basic mechanisms are that she's, using to explain her understanding of these things, rather than starting with, an itinerary of objects or things, and that includes, starting with cosmology and then working in. Maybe that's one way of looking at it.
Okay, Randy, well, let's then try to point to the text or glean from the text to have these clear distinction of these ideas, and then worry about how they work.
Right. So, I think Jim was, I was kind of using the laser pointer to point at some of these themes when Jim was hitting them in this section, like the essential self-extension. And there's all these little phrases, translated from her work, her phrases that articulate it. But it might be good to then flip our page and see how these themes relate then to the themes in this section, the pneumatic substance.
But I don't think I'm sorry, I want to go back with Bill to the, let's go to some texts on the Hyletic and just dwell on them and see if we get beyond gobbledygook.
Yeah. So is there a certain page you want to have us look at, Jim?
Go back to let's start at the beginning of where the Hyletic begins.
Yeah. Okay. So page 83 here.
Yeah, and I think somebody can just start reading. And what we can do is when somebody says, I don't get it, then we all say, neither do I, and then we move on, or we raise questions.
Yes. Okay, I love it.
Okay, I want to do some reading, because I think I'm not going to read very long before someone's going to say I don't get it.
Yeah, and let's see. Can we? The trouble with Randy, your visual here is that our faces are. Can you move it over one way so the whole text appears?
Yes. Okay. So what you're experiencing right now, Jim, is the little faces are superimposed upon the text.
Yes.
It is possible on your end. If your wife is there, she could especially help. If you grab
Well, I've got my book. I don't need that.
Yeah. Why don't you follow along in page 83 there? And we can throw out cues you can see when we turn the page and such.
Randy, for the future, it's better to just share the screen with the PDF without the backgrounds. Will be less work and keep attention more focused, and the text will be appearing larger. Don't put it into slides. You can just project the PDF, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you want to do that? I can do that. Here, I'll do that. Watch.
Yeah, do that. I think it will.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, Bill's going to start reading. Is that how we're going to do it?
Yeah, I'm going to start reading as soon as we're ready.
Yeah, one sec. Just so we're all on the same page, I'll project the regular PDF.
Okay.
Okay, hang on one sec, folks.
Well, I'm just going to read from my own copy of the PDF, which is big enough that I can read even with my eyes.
Okay.
Good.
Good.
Okay, we ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Section 3.6, Hyletic Substance. The paradigm for Hyletic substance in the empirical world is merely material natures, as they present themselves to us in a pre-scientific attitude. The entire cosmos, excluding only pure spirits if such there be, and for the eidetic analysis that latter question does not make any difference, shares in Hyletic substantiality. What we want to uncover are its eidetic notes, and so we shall abstractly attend to the purely material elements of the finished cosmos. The point of departure is thus no particular thing in the appearing physical cosmos, but the eidos. I'm not going to try to read the Latin, I guess, and the actual material things insofar as they show themselves to be Hyletic. The method is basically a pure eidetic analysis, bringing to givenness the topos, the type of the matter over against other relevant topi. Has everyone got that?
Is that clear? I mean, I don't say it's pellucid, but is there, sorry for the Latin there, but is that fairly clear in that paragraph now, what she's going to do?
Not to me.
Okay.
Where's the and the reason I have problems is you sort of say the point of departure is no particular thing.
Yeah.
But then you also say in the sentence before, we shall abstractly attend to the pure material elements of the finished cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some sort of game going on here.
Yep.
Where we have the finished cosmos, which is what we already have somehow or other constructed. I assume some hermetic understanding of this cosmos, and then we're gonna somehow or other aim for the eidos, which is something that's behind, in a sense, all of our understandings of this finished cosmos.
Yeah, but it's not that. That's true eventually, and that sounds preposterous, I admit. But what she's focusing here on is within a part of the cosmos, namely materiality.
Okay.
So it's not. So she's attending to the purely material elements. Now that's loaded because we don't know what that means yet.
Right.
So and that is the eidos of stuff, or the eidos of materiality, or stuff as such. And the actual material things insofar as they show themselves, and this is my, don't do it justice perhaps here, to be Hyletic, because out of this analysis of materiality as the bodiliness of the world of perception, she's going to tease out this underlying principle of the Hyle, of the Hyletic, in her sense. So it's not quite the Hyle of Aristotle. And
Okay.
but
I have a question about that. So when
Good.
you say stuff, is that the STOFF Latin word
Yeah.
that you were?
no, stuff is, I'm sorry, Stoff is German, meaning stuff.
Yeah.
In German, it means either material, but in material in the sense of what the material buy in the material goods store.
Right.
It's thought of immediately when you go to a material goods store. If you sew or you're redesigning your house, you're not going for any materiality of a particular already. You're not buying a finished stuff or an informed stuff. You're buying a stuff for a form, a stuff for a identifiable kind.
Right.
So you're going in there. You're buying stuff for your curtains, or stuff for your rugs, or stuff for your bedspreads.
So it's a stuff that you can make many things out of.
Yeah, and the world around us, is in the technological era, everything is stuff. For capitalism, everything is stuff. For a person who looks at the world, looks at a forest as a lumber, a person in the lumber business, all the trees are stuff.
It's like Marxian dollars or money.
That's for the sake of which.
Yeah, right, right.
And so and as Marx would say, the exchange value is transferred to the use value and the essentialness of materiality. But she's not going in that direction. But we have we're trying to tease out this kind of sense of stuff as it belongs to the whole bodiliness of the perceptual world that we live in.
Okay, let me continue reading, beginning in the second paragraph. The Hyletic substance's possibility of being itself is a completely passive and impersonal possibility. I got to stop there. How does she know that? Or why does she just postulate that?
Are you reading from her, Bill? I missed you. Or were you just...
I am. I'm reading that's the second paragraph, but I just finished.
I'm sorry. Oh, she says it's completely passive. Oh, is it so? It's an impersonal possibility. Now she's moving in the direction of stuff as such or materiality as such. That
Okay.
it's
So she's guided by her understanding in the phenomenal world with what this stuff is like.
Yeah, it can take this underlying material of all the bodies we see are already informed.
Right.
They're already either trees or they're suits or they're buildings or they're people or they're birds and so forth. But underlying them, there is their passivity as a possibility for form, because a bird can be used to make hats for the feathers, or could bird to be eaten. There are all sorts of forms which everything can be changed into, but that's possible, and it's maximally possible insofar as we're able to see something about what underlies them as bodily things, that they are able to take new forms and be used in new contexts.
All right. So it's starting to feel like Aristotle's substance.
No, not substance yet so much. It's
matter, I should say.
Yeah, really. That's his term, matter.
Right.
But because it's real, it will have. She's going to wrestle heavily, I think, with showing in what sense it is also presents itself as real.
Okay.
But it presents itself much differently as real as than, say, the pneumatic substance.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay.
In the second sentence, the Hyletic substance has a paradoxical character. The self, in quotes, which has the possibility of bearing or supporting itself, appears to have no self. But I assume that's just a matter of the impersonality thing. A material substance stands in the possibility to its own being only insofar as laden or burdened with its entire being. Its ground of itself only insofar as it rests in itself. It rests in itself only insofar as it is the ground of itself. It is through and through the substrate of itself, and it's resting in itself. Does everyone understand that?
Yeah, that is dense and almost utterly opaque. I acknowledge it.
Okay, well, let's just pass over it then.
Pardon?
Let's just pass over it then, because I agree.
I mean, as we read, I think it's important to just, kind of we could accept as hypotheses this illustration that she's drawing of like the inner workings of nature, accept them as hypotheses, and then once we understand the structure that she's describing, because it is weird, new, then we'll understand, why it's important.
This goes back to what I was suggesting earlier. This alleged eidetic analysis, because she's dealing with fairly elusive subject matter, there's going to be a kind of, we have to tune into what I want to suggest is kind of her poetics. What tipped me off on this, how her mind works on this, and I think this is, I don't think this is to be taken necessarily as a criticism of her. If you go through a TV program on modern physics, you are going to be saturated with the avalanche of metaphors that the physicists will use, and they can't be taken literally. Dark matter, why is it dark? In what sense does it matter? When it's full of a gravitational suction, which his primary concern is to bring all the matter around it into itself. It's we have here Let's do what Randy suggests. If we just kind of take this, we're trying to get a sympathy, or at least a hypothetical sympathy for the logic of the poetics, or the poetics of the eidetics here. And our point here is we'll see, as Randy's already intimated, it's in contrast with the other fundamental substance, which is almost the opposite of this. So that, I think, and I think that's the merit of Randy's proposal here, is that we will see better why this is what it is, how it's what it is, if we are able to. And I'm not going to say that the poetics of the pneumatic substance is going to be easy or easier to grasp, but you'll see that they contrast with one another.
So what I take she's sort of struggling with is to sort of repeat what you said, Jim, is that she's trying to understand what must be the case for this stuff if it can take on all forms. No?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. But it's also, that is part of it. It's going to be amenable, it's passive in that sense, and it's going to supply an underlying necessary principle or layer of a causal layer, in some sense causal layer, an ontological causal layer. But it's also, she's playing at the same time practically with the other inherited notion of corporeality or bodiliness as pars, extra partes, bodies apart, outside of itself, parts outside of themselves, was the scholastic notion. So this extensiveness of the stuff, it doesn't rest in itself as the ego does, as the spirit does. It in fact is essentially extended outside of itself and perpetuating this self-extendedness insofar as it can.
Well, I want to add one more thing, and I hope this is not too far off base. There was when atomism was first suggested. I don't bring this up to indicate what we were talking about previously. It was first brought up, whatever it was, in the 16th century and down around that period, is that one of the big problems that people had with atomism, there would be this question: well, what then are atoms made out of? And so this is sort of what I think she's saying in these few complicated sentences here. She's trying to address that this stuff can't be made of other stuff, that somehow or other it has to be itself, in itself. It has, you know what I'm trying to say? There's something peculiar about stuff if it's not already made of something. It's sort of like a bottom. I don't know how to say it. Anyway, that's just my suggestion about how to understand what she's talking about here.
Okay, maybe I didn't quite get that because it's partly my hearing, but if that helps you, good.
Okay. All right. Well, let me keep on that, and because we're going to come up with one of your famous words in a few seconds here. In the next sentence, you say Conrad-Martius attempts to eliminate this characteristic from various perspectives. First of all, material substance presents itself in substantial bodiliness. And this in turn is a mode of self-presentation. If a being exists in such a way that its being is nothing else than a self-presenting, and if this self-presentation in the being is substantially grounded in it, that is, in the being itself, then pure bodiliness is given. And this is the case with the Hyletic substantiality. Has everyone got that?
Yeah, that's okay. Just if I could just jump in for a second here.
Good.
Here is where she's offering a kind of surprise to us, that she's offering a kind of physics of phenomenality. It will come out later when light is introduced. And for Olga, this is especially important because Suwardi, the Iranian metaphysician that she works with, has also a desire to not separate phenomenality and manifestness and light, the luminosity of things, which is one way of talking about phenomenology, from it's being rooted in bodiliness. And this, of course, is what she sees, or apparently many post-Einsteinian people see, materiality to be inseparable from some sense of light. That the principle of bodiliness is, and that's why her theme of ether comes in here. What we call, and this goes back to Chomsky's remark that I've been stuck with for 15, 20 years, is it's not spirit or mind that's puzzling, it's matter. And because we're stuck with the image of matter as a klutzy chunk of mud or a rock, and we've been disabused of that image, but it sticks. And when you get to see how a physicist looks at, and suddenly realize you're looking at photons and neurons cascading and popping in and out of being, and yet accounting for the extensiveness of matter, it gets dizzying. And that's what she's introducing us to, this homology, the sameness, analogous sameness of meeting between the various levels of the life world, the physical world, and then the metaphysical world. I think I shouldn't have said all that. Just
no, you should keep saying things. So can you say more about, because maybe I don't have a good enough feeling for what bodiliness means. Because again, I'm confused because we have these two kinds of bodies in Husserl.
Okay, bodiliness, she, in her analysis of one of her first works, the first work that we appeared in Husserl's yearbook was the Erscheinungslehre. I forget the full title, but the theory of appearings. And she showed that there was something about the bodies, especially in terms of there being not only having shapes, but they're being colored and they're being in motion and so forth, that our world of perception was bombarded with the self-presentation of bodies. And what's interesting about the self-presentation or the appearing of bodies is that they are ecstatic to themselves, and this goes back to this earlier definition of Hyletic. They are essentially outside of themselves, essentially self-displacing beyond themselves. Now she is taking that physical self-displacement beyond themselves and making it in some sense homologous, in some sense isomorphic, in some sense of the same essence of manifestation as the thing's disclosing itself to an agent of manifestation or a mind. This is for me, a very problematic, because I want to keep appearances in the realm of mind and manifestation, not in the mind, but the way our minds are unified with the world around us through what we call knowing. Don't forget, I'm still an Aristotelian in this respect, that knowing is the identity of knower and known in the act of knowing. And how is it how can I here be one with, through the act of knowing, that tree that's 100 yards away, that is being accounted for by this theme of manifestation of things appearing, things presenting themselves while remaining in themselves, but while being ecstatic to themselves and therefore available and actuated by minds.
So is she speaking here of the pre-given?
Sorry?
Is she speaking here of the pre-given?
Well, it's pre-given until we start making it explicit. I mean, manifestation is something that's constantly, I'm reluctant to say it's merely pre-given, as somebody who's for 70 years has been doing phenomenology, not that long, 60 years. But it's, the phenomenality of things is if you're living excessively in the epoche, is kind of and it's not a thing, but it can't be neglected if I'm knowing things phenomenologically. I mean, I can't help but see that I'm seeing this thing from one side rather than another side, and all the sides can't be given at once. That looks different under this light rather than under that light. It looks different to you rather than it looks to me. But if I walk over to where you are, I see it looking the way you see it looking. And all these looks of things, all these manifestations of things, she is giving a realontological, quasi-cosmological account of through her analysis, beginning analysis, because it gets more complicated later, beginning analysis of stuff. Really.
Well, let me keep reading.
Can I ask a
because
question, Jim?
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, I want to ask a question, okay, regarding this. 2 points. First, it looks to me, and I may be wrong, as Aristotle's Hyles abstracted and added a concept of extension. Then another, and I may be wrong, but if anybody knows the genetics or history of the concept, it would be helpful. I mean, Aristotle doesn't speak about Hyletics as a substance, because his substances are individuals. So it's an individuated Hyles. And it seems that this concept migrates into Hedwig Conrad-Martius' description, except for that animates the Hyles by adding extension. And this is actually very interesting, I think, because in her reading, Hyles is self-revealing as opposed to being masked by superimposed intentionality. Because if Hyletics has extensionality, it's the origin of, it's like, in a sense, like a proto-intentionality. So
it
yeah.
works with intentionality for her.
Yeah.
There is a mutual collaboration in our encounter with bodies, because what we don't, this is an important point for her, I think, insofar as she's a realist. And what we know in knowing something is not what we laminate on or make up about the thing, but the thing's self-presentation, which we become in tune with. And she's trying to, rightly or wrongly here, she's trying to say that the Hyletic, the self-extendedness of something, is not merely, and neither of these are, we'll see eventually, in space. These are constitutive of space. So it's not as if the bodiliness, the Hyles is leaving itself in space and going instead of being there, it's over here. It's on the one hand, for her, space is being made by the thing. But also what's also going on here is that it is presenting itself, which is more than just extending itself. But the extension includes both the presentation and it's occupying, that's to say, making space. And that's going to be the ambition here, is to tie all this into a quantum or quasi-Einsteinian description of what the stuff is made of.
Well, I think that's this is helpful, because in philosophies which focus on phenomenological materiality, like of life, Henri, for example, The problem is individuation of phenomenological materiality, because it is not given the property of extension or self-transcendence. It's invisible always. And
I'm sorry, Olga, I can't, I need to read your lips too, because I'm only,
okay, okay.
I'm seeing only
Can
half.
you okay? Can you see me better now?
That's better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for this, Jim. Zoom makes one invisible, that's for sure. So what I wanted to say is that in philosophy of phenomenological materiality of Henri, the concept of stuff is devoid of extension or capacity of self-transcendence.
Yes,
Phenomenological materiality is invisible.
yes.
And then he comes up with a problem of individuation because, of course, it's not clear how does one proceed into separate beings, and the whole of phenomenology, if phenomenological materiality, which is the foundation of appearing, is in itself invisible and doesn't have a potential of visibility. So I think that she dealt with this problem, and if she ascribes Hyletic extensionality, that makes it into much more manageable concept in terms of developing the whole of phenomenology further on.
No. You really might be onto something. I'm a little cold on, maybe Jeremy can help us here too, but I'm a little cold on Henri's materialism. But I think many of us will agree that his account of knowing in terms of the manifestness, the agency of manifestation and the self-presentation of the world gets reduced to the non-intentional self-affecting of consciousness, and that it seems to be almost a self-sufficiency of knowing, and there's almost as if intentionality is a an afterthought or negligible. That's a distortion of what he obviously wants to say, but there is a sense in which he is, if this is materiality, it's a materiality which is reducible to spirit insofar as consciousness is essentially the paradigm form of spiritual self-consciousness is the paradigm form of spirit.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Henri uses the term material phenomenology, but it's not, that has nothing to do with the concept of the Hyletic that we're here discussing. If anything, I think the weakness of Henri is that he only deals with what Conrad-Martius calls archonic or the I or the or pneumatic being, and the whole realm. In fact, they're interesting to pair together because the whole realm that Conrad-Martius is exploring in this amazing and sometimes confusing way is exactly what Henri has nothing to say about. And how to put the two together, I think, is a really interesting and fascinating question, because on the other hand, Conrad-Martius really at least tries to, and I think does, do justice to both the realm of objects and nature, but also the realm of the subject and the I. And a lot of things that she says about the I, apparently, in describing pneumatic or archonic being, really correlate, I think, quite closely to a lot of things that Henri is saying. But when Henri uses the word material, it's in a very totally different sense. For him, Hule or Hyletic is feeling, is the current of feeling. It's lived feeling.
Right.
That's what he means by Hule, and he does not mean matter in a
Okay,
physical sense.
thanks, Jeremy. But I think I would disagree. I think it depends on whether one is reading, what book of Henri one is reading. There is, of course, material phenomenology, but there are also his later books. And when you talk about affectivity, I think it's more later Henri. But the beginning, when he just, when he develops material phenomenology in response to Husserl's treatment to Hule, he doesn't bring in yet the notion of affectivity, but rather compares relationship between Hule and intentionality in Husserl with the primacy that he gives to phenomenological materiality in terms of unmasking it as the foundational a priori, as the foundational horizon of all appearances, which in itself is invisible. But there is also a message from David Jager on the chat, who says, when you're all talking about unreasonable of materiality, are drawing mostly from his work of the title Material Phenomenology. So the problem is that his concept of phenomenological materiality develops as he works off philosophy of the body, interpreting me in the Briand's view, and then proceeds into the different levels of his writing.
Well, I think that's true, but I read all of that, and I think he tries to deal with the body, and it's very insightful, and the connection to Men Buran are very interesting. I don't know, just on the basis of my having studied it, I don't see, however, a big change in his notion of affectivity. And in one book, he has a book called Phenomenology of Materiel, and he uses that word material. I think he just means affectivity, and he just means what Hule talked about in terms of what Husserl talked about in terms of Hule. I stick with what I'm saying. I don't think Henri ever effectively even grapples with the question of nature in the way at all.
I agree. That last statement I would agree with. Yeah.
I just want to say, and I think that we should move on to pneumatic substance at this point, just to get some good contrast going, since we've had such a good conversation about this Hyletic substantiality. But I just want to say that, in fact, in Aristotle, in in the physics, the metaphysics, and in On the Heavens, in the very beginning of On the Heavens, it's really a drawing out of the concept of extension and the continuum and dimensionality in terms of magnitude, megathes, and he draws it out in terms of like the point, line, plane series, and he is talking about three-dimensionality. All of this discussion that begins in On the Heavens is kind of implicit in all the other concepts, like entelecheia, and the psyche being like a, he has, in De Anima, he has a certain definition of what the soul is in terms of entelecheia. That's the foundation of all of his noetics. But even the word itself, entelecheia, it has like a self-standing kind of nature, or a, like in itself, like quite literally in terms of like.
I read entelecheia. The etymology of it is very interesting. And it has the word having in it, with CHIA on the end of it. And it has telos in it, and it has immanence within it. And entelecheia is translated, say, by the typical translations as actuality. But Aristotle's understanding of actuality comes primarily from beings that come into development in time. And so if we were to take the word entelikeia in its etymological and in its, for him, I believe its phenomenological roots, we would best say, instead of enteliki or entelikeia, that which has the end in itself in a way which is not yet complete. And this is, you're absolutely right, this is key for Conrad-Martius, because you have the Realontology stuck into that word. You have the self-actuation of something in itself. So it's an actualization of a potency that's in itself. And the potency is there in advance, but the potency also enables a self-actualization and the telos of that, the perfect, the completed form is what's luring it on as both a final cause and in some sense as a pushing cause. So it's an amazing neologism. And it comes back, we'll be looking at it because Hans Driesch, you mentioned, I think earlier, is the person from whom she gets the word in trying to account for the various differences of theoretical biology and how you account for the fertilized egg becoming Einstein.
Right, and Merleau-Ponty also draws very heavily on Driesch in his work on nature as well. My point also was that all these concepts, like the physics, the topic of the physics is body, and so there's this concept of the body and bodiliness, in all of Aristotle's physics, and in the metaphysics, he meditates more on the dimensional indices, point, line, plane, and how they relate to like geometry and number. But I mean the like prime mover and all these other fascinating theological, metaphysical topics of what Aristotle calls first philosophy, have a kind of bearing on each of the other more like common concepts that he's dealing with, like body and physis, nature, and all these Aristotelian concepts. So she's being very Aristotelian. She's also, and so many things. I mean, she's a synthesis of all these elements. Of course, but because they all have something good to say. But looking at what she says in particular, her own unique thought, I think we should look at I mean, if there's anything else, Jim, or if anyone wants to say anything about Hyletic, about what the exact like mechanism, how it's in itself, and yet how it's different from the pneumatic way of like self-standing and self-illuminating. I think we should get like a good contrast between these two concepts to understand them. And maybe for today, we're just focusing on this since we're coming to our last like 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, I don't know if we look at Hyletic more, Randy, and say pneumatic, because I don't think we've scratched the surface yet here.
Yeah.
On the Hyletic.
I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So Bill, you want to be our leader here?
Oh, you're muted, Bill. Let me ask to unmute you.
Wherever you want to begin there.
Okay, well, I was hoping somebody else would pick up the baton here.
I'm happy.
In the normal part.
Yeah, so I think we left off, at the top of 84? I could just, do you want to just continue?
No, I was hoping to do what you suggested, to get this contrast, and just say something about the pneumatic before we finish today.
Well, okay, I mean, why don't we?
All right, that's fine with me. That's fine with me.
All right, so I'll begin here with 3.7. This is on page 87. I'll bring our shared screen there. Okay, so I'll begin here. In this section, we are again analyzing something that does not phenomenally show itself in its pure form in the empirical cosmos. Thus, the situation in the eidetic analysis of spirit is similar to that of the analysis of Hyletic being. What follows is a formal sketch of lengthy material analyses of the ontological distinctions between plant, animal, and man. The goal of the analysis is to sort out the eidos of I-ness, which characterizes the spiritual nature of man. This means finding the topos of what we refer to in the first person singular, i.e.
What clearly means place.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this means finding the placing of what we refer to in the first person singular, i.e. I, over against the regions of life, bodiliness, and soul, which, though subsumed into the formation of the human I, do not constitute spirituality as such, inasmuch as they stand in the Hyletic region, i.e. of body, or potential region, soul. I actually, you know, that should be a period, huh?
It should be a period. That's good. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, but I do think that I think you and Rodney talked to the publisher and got those recalled, and I'm just working with an earlier version, and our PDF is earlier. Okay.
We got that. Oh, we didn't get it. That's still there. That's a typo.
Yeah. Okay, but so I do think perhaps it would be useful to pause here. Did we all understand this sentence? I mean, I think it's an important one, especially considering the phenomenologies of life, you know, and how such a notion of the I and of spirituality, the domain of this I, you know, spirituality in this rarefied sense, perhaps, but is also all encompassing and applicable to spiritual things from other, you know, discourses. You know,
May I
let's
just say
understand
something here, Randy?
Yeah.
This little sentence here, when she's they stand. Let's see. It only has to do with the human I. Do not constitute spirituality as such. In her metaphysical Gespräche, in her metaphysical dialogues, and of course, knowing, you know, the speculations of the medievals and so forth, she was thinking about other forms, combinations, almost like Tolkien, of kind of spiritual beings, which had different forms of bodiliness, for one thing. But then angels are a different form of consciousness and way of, and what they refer to, how they refer to themselves, and what kind of self presence they have is going to be different. And these would be eidetic variations that she's referring to, and what she's tried to conduct in partly in that book. But she's, of course, she's sticking, and then there's going to be God is not going to be deprived of some sense of personhood or some sense of egoity. And so that's just a footnote to that. So when so the pure essence of a spirit is for an eidetic variation, which might be stimulated by a history of religions or a history of theology. This would be, that's the point of that kind of restricting the notion of I to human being here as something not regrettable, but as not to be overlook the fact that there might be other forms of self-reference.
Yeah, and indeed there are, of course. I mean, the animal, the plant.
Well, that's another question, whether an animal or plant refer in the same way as a human refers. That's a big issue. But and that would be a very equivocal sense of self-reference, the way the plant has itself, but doesn't have its having of itself, to use her way of doing it. And what I would mean in self-reference, and what self would mean in self-reference, insofar as we want to say plants have self-reference, would be radically different.
Right, and material, pure, like the self-referentiality of a crystal is different than the self-referentiality of a particle or a rock that's not a crystal. I don't know.
Yeah, those are all, you know, those are the kind of topics we want to raise, but we don't want to. Let's keep going.
Yeah. Okay. The first consideration would be the essential distinction between living and non-living. We have seen an important sense in which the entire cosmos is a living cosmos. Nature is self-generative or self-creative form, should be of, out of its own potency. The distinction cannot reside merely then in self-creativity, for the itselfness of whatever is rooted in this possibility to ground itself. There's an important concept.
No.
I'll continue. Nor can it lie in applying the notion of telos, or final causality, to living beings and not to non-living beings. As we shall see, the coming to be of the entire cosmos is rooted in a telic process. The chief distinction is that living beings bring to empirical givenness the self-creativity of nature from out of its own possibilities. Here we see a self-generation out of its own potency. And that which we see shows that within this dimension of nature, the living being generates itself in such a way that the natural self-creative process is once again realized. Non-living beings are once and for all finished, even though this finished formation obtains through final causal dimensions of potency. The living being, on the other hand, obtains through its own pre-actual intellectual processes, potencies, to a non-finished and through self-creative form. Here is a completely different dimension and a fully new level of nature.
So
Okay.
how does that sound, everybody? How does that sound?
I mean, this is the same kind of intuition in contemporary theories of life. Like I mentioned, autopoietic theory in the natural science, naturalized natural science of systems biology, and as well in Timonetska's Phenomenology of Life as Ontopoietic process. Both of these contain that basic intuition that I think we all get. Life is self-generating in some respect, or is able to harness, to yoke the self-generative capacities of nature that is its unfolding or fusing out like a plant, a futon.
Well, this has, okay. This has similarities with Sartre's distinction between in itself and for itself, except that I'm pretty sure that Sartre wants to limit for itself to mankind. Are we meaning something here that all life is in some sense unfinished or not completed, or is it just human beings that have this property?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that, Bill.
Okay, I'll start over again. So I was saying that it seems to me that there's similarities between this and Sartre's distinction between in itself and for itself, and but for Sartre, I believe the for itself is to be limited to human beings.
I think that's right. I think and it's certainly true of the philosophical heritage, say, from Fichte on and Kant on. Kant doesn't use, as far as I know, for itself in the strict sense of self-consciousness, but I do think in animality there is a more feeble form of for itself. The plant doesn't have itself, she'll say. I'm sorry. The plant, in a way, has itself because it's self-restoring, self-generating, self-nurturing, and so forth, self-duplicating. So there's a kind of, but there's no center there. It's distributed throughout the whole organism. The animal has itself. There's a sense in which it will move itself. It will not decide, but it will initiate wanting to play or to be indicate its needs by barking or so forth. But there's not that element we call freedom there. And she makes that distinction that the spirit has the having of itself and the animal doesn't have its having of itself. There's kind of This fellow is very interesting. Helmut Plessner book on the, I forget the full title of the book, The Place of Man in Nature, something like that. But what he calls the eccentric position. There is always the possibility of acting on yourself, of having yourself, of being outside of yourself, which we are most familiar with in terms of reflection. And we are, and that's for her terribly important because we're self-creators. And that we have, that means we have this fundamental interval, that fundamental gap, that fundamental distance to ourselves that plants and animals don't have. And so this is, well, I'll just leave it at that because we'll be talking about that. Is that, Bill, does that help?
It does, except that now I'm a little bit confused because I want to know whether her pneumatic are only human, or because we're talking about, right now we're talking about distinction between living and non-living.
Pneumatic is primarily the spiritual being. And that'll be the human being. I think that's right. I think that's, but she's going to, she wrote a little book on the soul of plants. She didn't write much on animals at all. But she wrote more on what we would call this, the animate world than she did on either the spiritual world or the animal world. I mean, the self-found in the tour primarily deals with biology, and the problem of the coming to be of spirit, something I don't agree with what she says about that. That's a different topic.
Well, I'm wondering too whether, because it's always appealed to me, but I think it's an Aristotelian, but certainly a Thomistic notion of soul, of where the soul is not, as we've done it in the modern world, located in some place, but it's some sort of organizing principle and what animates the organism to be an organism. So is that sort of what she's getting at here?
Something like that, yes, for sure, for sure. There's the hylomorphism, as the Thomists would say, or the Scholastic would say, the two principles together explain the the animated world, and that would include the vegetative world, animation in the sense of having some sense of soul, but there'll be differences obviously in terms of the anima, what kind of soul is in play there, and the differences are significant. But the pneumatic, if I got it right, the pneumatic is the old Greek word for spirit. And whereas Aristotle's soul is psyche, he will use the same word, our base word for etymological root for psychology or the psyche, for the soul, the generic notion of soul. And she will use that same generic notion of soul, but she doesn't. But with human beings, you deal less with psyche or anima than you do with pneuma.
So why don't we, since we're kind of running out of time, maybe I should wrap it up now. But I just feel like maybe if people have a few more minutes, we can just look at the first sentences of the upcoming paragraphs, because I think it is good to get a sense of the continuation of this theme. We've been talking now in this paragraph about life, and the next paragraph begins, we can now ask about the prototype of a living being, the plant. And then she says in the next sentence, the plant has no position within itself. So we've been talking about this a bit, right? And then just to scooch us along here a bit, this next paragraph on 89, an animal, on the other hand, has a kind of interiority, a depth, a center, a position within and by which it can feel and move itself. The animal is not only excarnated bodiliness, but it is also freed from this being totally given over to its bodily formation to give a position interior to this process. So we have like an inner dimension And then it continues, soul is the dimension of depth, an interiority which animals and man have, and by which bodiliness is felt within and motorically controlled. Any sentence that starts soul is very valuable, right? Especially in this, where she's articulating a language that can handle these, transnatural potencies, or doing this analysis, so anyway, there's a lot of really great stuff. Mine's all colorful, all marked up. I love this paragraph. But then, because we're running out of time, and I just want to like run us through some of this. The next paragraph, the animal stands in a kind of retroscendence to its body. She discusses this in a few places, this term retroscendence, and it's really interesting. And so retroscendence is transcendence in reverse, inasmuch as it has its bodiliness in the hand, and therefore is withdrawn from this bodiliness. So it like has a grasp of its own bodiliness and knows how to, do kung fu, let's say, or do tongue fu and do verbal linguistics, like it has an interiority that it can really like use. It has a fully developed inner picture, maybe. Is that a good way of putting it, Jim?
Yes, I think so. I missed that too, because she's saying that there is a kind of eccentricity even in the animal that Plessner would keep exclusively to the human, and that's very interesting. I'm fond of that, because I'm a dog lover, and I do see, I see, my dog fools me. She wants to negotiate with me. She wants to. We have this. I'll just give you an example. She knows that if she looks at me a certain way, I'll act in a certain way. And so when we take a hike, we have a kind of mutual extortion racket. And so if we come to certain, we live across from the woods, and if we come to certain junctures, she gets a cookie. The cookie is, she knows if she stays close to me, she'll get a cookie in return, but she's not going to get cookies unless she stays relatively close to me. So she makes up junctures then. She comes to a new place, smiles at me, sits down very sweetly, and says, this is a juncture. She proclaims it to be a juncture. So we're kind of having a game. She understands that I understand that this is not the right juncture, but she knows that if she looks in a certain way hard enough and often enough, she's going to get her will, in quotes, that she's going to get a cookie. Now, this is a very complex process, and I don't just have a smart dog. All dogs seem to have this capacity. So this sense of this retroscendence here, or this eccentricity of the dog, is I think worth noting. And of course, it supports evolutionary theory that there's a kind of, and this is important, and it's a basic question behind it all, of the problem of the sharp demarcation between species. And she's making pretty sharp demarcations, but she's not overlooking, a suggestion of continuity between that man is, of course, this is Aristotle too, that in some sense man is the speaking animal, the animal who speaks, who has logos, both in the rich sense as well as in the obvious sense of what do we call linguistics, speaking, having a tongue.
Yeah, and just the very idea of inner retroscendence, is a fascinating concept to introduce into the general philosophical nomenclature. And on a couple pages later, on page 91, you also mention it again in reference to immanent transcendence, that a term we might find in Henri, in Merleau-Ponty, and in other key places, and of course in Husserl. And
I don't think we find that term explicitly, do we, Randy, in any of those thinkers?
Oh yeah, well, okay, so I know Merleau-Ponty, I think Henri, and I know certainly some people. See, I don't know if it's in Husserl or if it's in other people talking about Husserl. You know, these figures like maybe Plessner or someone like that. But I mean, it's definitely a term that floats around out there. And you know, Merleau-Ponty was very, well, I don't know, very influenced by Conrad-Martius. He refers to her, as you point out in here, you know, in Phenomenology of Perception. So I mean, she was an influence on people. So I don't know if she's the genesis of the term or if it's Husserl.
Rather late too. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
But it's curious because, you know, we know transcendence, we know immanence, and we also know certain things like in Husserl, there's the transcendence of the ego and of other things. The body has a kind of null point, 0 point, like transcendence of the like center or unity of a manifold or of a field, a phenomenal field, as Merleau-Ponty calls it, you know. But then there's like a secondary transcendence, that of like the world, and then there's yet another kind of transcendence, that of God, you know. And then all of these, I wonder if this retroscendence is, you know, like a kind of, you know, transcendence of transcendence or secondary transcendence. Or
the big point here is what we're getting at is that, and it's again this poetics in the eidetics. The first thought that comes to mind is the unmoved mover. That there is to move yourself, which is arcanal. That's what the arche means, beginning here. That you begin your beginning. You are the source of your beginning, and there's nothing you can appeal to. So you get behind yourself. That's the retro.
okay,
you get behind yourself. You become, in that sense, ecstatic to yourself in order to move yourself. Now that is simultaneous with your essential transcendence. And you get behind yourself to move yourself vis-a-vis the infinity of being, which is the transcendence. And so this I think maybe we should begin. I just suggest that we begin that next time, because this is worth thinking about.
Yeah.
The Chisholm, even a modern great analytic philosopher, speaks of the problem of freedom precisely in terms of the Aristotelian unmoved mover. And that Conrad-Martius said, you know, uses the word arcanal for this, that with I am means I begin. And Hannah Arendt said that, interestingly too, that she spoke of what the political force of the realm of the polis is that you had autonomous voices there, each of which came into the world as a radically new beginning. There's nothing like anybody else. And that was bestowed on each person a kind of dignity. But curiously, she took over that notion, or she herself had that notion of arcanal being, of spirits or of human beings. So I think we might want to,
yeah.
And this is all playing at the same time here, trying to keep consistent the contact and the sameness and difference with Hyletic being, which has a kind of opposite. You know, it doesn't get beyond itself to begin itself. It is always already being pulled from itself or being ahead of itself without being behind itself.
Yeah, I think of it as like there's an excess on both the nomadic and noetic sides, you know, both on the Hyletic and the pneumatic sides. There's an excess.
Yes.
And the excesses are coming from a kind of another level of a like ultimate primary excessiveness of maybe being, or the infinite, the empiric dimension.
The beginning notion of being, that we're immersed, we're awakened. Our being conscious is being awakened to the infinity of being in a pre-reflective grasp. It's a constitutive. Jeremy recognizes both Lavelle and Rosmini and Shaka, that there's interesting agreement on this topic. That this the consciousness, intellectual consciousness, constituted by this transcendence, openness to being. Regardless of if it's real being or ideal being, we talk all about that later, coming up.
Yeah. Okay, well, there's a lot more to say about this. I think we should begin with pneumatic being next time, the arcanal notion. But this has been great. I think we need to close it up.
Yeah, we'll come back to all of the Hyletic when we wrestle with the awful hard stuff of space.
Yes, the wonderful stuff.
Good. I'm glad you love it. It was agony pulling it together.
I'm so sorry. Well, thank you for doing that hard work. You know, this 1972 work, which is now the more heavily publicized 2020 work, is contributing to the language, you know, that Whitehead says, you know, a completed metaphysical knowledge must await, or a true metaphysical knowledge must await a completed language, you know, and that's what he tries to develop in his speculative schema. But I think she also is, you know, developing the tools that we need in order to shed light in that dunkel dimension.
So when are we going to meet next?
Oh yes. So let's, you know, last Friday of the month, let's have a look at it real quick here. That would be the 28th. If that works for everyone, 2 weeks from today.
I'm not sure it'll work for me, but you can carry on without me, I'm sure. So
yeah. So and Rodney said that he hoped to be here today. He hasn't forgotten about us. We just he's getting his precious shot. You know.
That's important.
Mine.
Canada's short on vaccine, so I'm very glad he's getting them now.
Good. Yeah. So he'll be here too, as you know, as well. Okay. So I'll send out the Google Calendar invite, and we'll be in touch over our interesting emails, and see you all on the 28th. Thank you.
Good seeing you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.